anti-slavery and women's rights conventions. The conductor of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia was William Still. He was a black man, and his wife Lavinia. And Frances Harper stayed with them oftentimes in their home. William Still and Frederick Douglass were very strong female/feminist/women's rights supporters from the very, very beginning. They always felt that women should have the right. Unfortunately, there was always a metaphor that the woman's struggle to get out of the home was synonymous with the struggle and the oppression of slavery. And if you've read Angela Davis's new book, which documents women, race, and class, and the struggles to combine that and the divisions that have arose because of that, it was really difficult, I guess. So I'm going to talk now about two personalities, primarily Sarah Mapps Douglass and Charlotte L. Fortin Grimke. And she was related to the Grimke sisters. You may know them. They were the daughters of South Carolina plantation owners and slave owners as well. And they left South Carolina because they were very disillusioned with the whole institution of slavery, and they came north. They became interested in the Society of Friends, and Sarah joined first, and then her sister Angelina joined her a few years later. And they were very outspoken, both about the Society of Friends practice and prejudice within it of segregating the blacks who came to meeting. They made them sit on a separate bench. And Sarah Douglass was one of the first people to expose this. She was a teacher and abolitionist. She was born into a very prominent family. Her father was Cyrus Bustill, and he was a baker and an administrator of a school, and they had a lot of money. A lot of money. I mean, comparatively, it's probably a little bit of money now. In the 1820s, she opened a school for blacks, but it was suffering so, and they had such financial hardships that in 1838, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society helped support the school financially. So it really took a real burden off, because things were starting to get very repressive in the Philadelphia area because it was such a center for underground activity. Let's see, later, her work with the Female Society, her mom was a founder of that, which is kind of interesting. It included Lucretia Mott and Reverend Robert Purvis, who was active in the underground in Philly, and Charlotte Fortin. And she became aware of like deep-seated segregation, and when she went away to school, like she just was really kind of pissed. When she came back, she realized that the Society of Friends were, you know, I guess speaking with fire, essentially, because they were the main proponents for equal rights, and yet they segregated the people who came to meeting with them. So it was kind of frustrating, and she, you know, she just exposed it. She wrote to her friend, I think his name is William Mask in Boston, and started providing him with literature and observations about the prejudice. Let's see. Unfortunately, those practices didn't go unchanged for like several decades, so they were slow to learn, I suppose. She took over the girls' primary department of the Institute for Colored Youth, and that later became Cheney State College. And in 1838, Sarah and her mom attended Angelina Grimke's wedding, and it caused such an uproar that there were blacks at this wedding that like 2 days later they burned Pennsylvania Town Hall, which was the state office building or the state meeting place for the State Anti-Slavery Society, and 2 days later they burned the shelter for orphan kids, for colored orphans, you know. So at this point, you know, violence had really reached its peak. The next person that I'm going to touch on, and it'll basically be the end because I'm sure Mr. Bloxam will talk about the people who were less well known, is Charlotte Fortin Grimke. She was a teacher and an author, and she was born into a really well-to-do family as well. Her father and her grandfather were sailmakers in Philadelphia, and they were very strong supporters, both financially and spiritually, of William Lloyd Garrison's publication, periodical, The Liberator. And After her mom's real premature death, she went to live with her uncle Robert Purvis, and he really started to sensitize her to the struggles that blacks were having, even in a free society, because she became really in tune with the segregation there. So, like, right from her early childhood, she was around very progressive people. Her parents, her aunt, as I said, Margaretta Fortin, was at that first meeting in 1833 of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. And she was sent away to Salem, Massachusetts to be educated by her father because he didn't want to send her to segregated schools in Philadelphia. And that caused real problems, too. She later married Francis James Grimke, and from the research, I couldn't quite figure out, he was the slave son of her uncle, Henry Grimke, but the encyclopedia also said that Henry Grimke was the brother of Sarah and Angelina, but I think that's
the latter part.
The latter part? Okay. Well, I wanted to get that confirmed. So it's real interesting. At first she didn't like him, but then she grew to like him. And essentially, so the women's movement and the anti-slavery movement was joined there for about 30 years or so. Unfortunately, in 1867, when they had the 14th Amendment debate, there was a convention in New York. It was both the Anti-Slavery Society and the American Equal Rights Association. And it was at this convention that Elizabeth Cady Stanton made a presentation, and she says, "If all men are to vote, black and white, lettered and unlettered, washed and unwashed, then the safety of the nation, as well as the interests of women, demand that we outweigh this incoming tide of ignorance, poverty, and vice with the virtue, wealth, and education of the women in the country." So, essentially, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was saying that the black man would not get the vote before the women, and she went so far as to get the support of Frederick Douglass, who at the time, I think he felt, politically was a safe move, and that began the split in the women's movement for the most part. And I think it's relative today because 100 years ago, people started to see that their concerns were a little different, or their priorities as far as where they show their solidarity was starting to trickle down and get splintered, I guess. So that's my presentation.
Burroughs, who lives in New York City and is a well-known, internationally known actress, will perform. You're also UN representative to
Women's International. I was standing over there, so I'm quite aware that when you're on the corner, you can't very well see. Of course, like all of us here, I feel the spirit of Harriet Tubman. The Chinese have a proverb, hold up half the head, and we know that women are more than half the world. And part of what we're trying to do as women at Encampment, at Seneca, at Greenham, at Comiso, at many, many places around the world, we're trying to marshal the energies of women to transform the world. This is a very small planet, and this is a very small family. It is imperative that we do not let living things perish, and they will perish if the arms continues. And we know also that peace is not only the absence of conflict, it is social justice. Said many, many times. Certainly the spirit of Harriet Tubman reflects that where you have hunger, is war. Have ignorance. When you have squatter settlements, people eating out of garbage, I see in my neighborhood, no homes, or people dying of disease and lack of immunization and lack of food, that is war. And that's why we must stop the deployment of the cruise and missiles in Western Europe, not only this year, but any year. And I think it's important to understand that we But we must also realize that the missiles are all deployed in the barrios, in the ghettos, in the Bantustans, in the occupied territories. So that's what we're talking about. We are about making the connections, and now there is a wonderful poet, Robert Hayden, who died a few years ago, and he has written a piece called Runagate, Runagate. And normally if I were on stage, I'd have a costume, but I came up in the bus last night with my sleeping bag and just what I have on. So I don't have the long red robe that I usually have on. But this is Runagate, which is an old-fashioned, almost obsolete word meaning run away. Runs, falls, rises, stumbles on from darkness into darkness, and the darkness thicketed with shapes of terror, and the hunters pursuing, and the hounds pursuing, and the night cold, and the night long, and the river to cross, and darkness ahead, and doubt ahead, and when shall I reach that somewhere morning, and keep on going, and never turn back? Runagate, nigger, runagate. Many thousand rise and go. Many thousands crossing over. Some go weeping and some rejoicing. Some in coffins and some in carriages. Some in silk, most in shackles. Rise and go, or fare you well. No more auction block for me. No more drivers lash for me. Runagate, runagate. If you see my Pompey, 30 years of age, new breeches, plain stockings, nigger shoes, if you see my Anna, likely young mulatto, branded E on the right cheek and R on the left, catch them if you can and notify subscriber. Catch them if you can. But they will run underground when you try to catch them. Plunge into quicksands, whirlpools, mazes. They will turn to scorpions when you try to catch them. Salamanders, nettles, they will turn to fire. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. North Star and Bonanza Gold. I'm bound for the freedom, freedom bound. And oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. Runagate, runagate, and it is now she comes. Harriet Tubman, whip-scarred woman of earth, risen out of bondage, risen from their power and their anguish, for to be a calling, for to be a shining, mean to be free. And this is the way, brethren, the way we journeyed from Kant to Can, moon so bright and no place to hide, the cry up and the paterolers riding, hound dogs belling in bladed air, and fear starts a murbling, he'll never make it, he'll never make it. Hush that now. She's turned upon us, level pistol glinting in the moonlight. Dead folks, cat jaybird talk. You keep on going now or die. Wanted. Harriet Tubman, alias conductor, alias Moses, stealer of slaves, in league with the bigots, Alcott, Emerson, Hussey, Haviland, with the traitors, Garrison, Still, Thoreau, the troublemakers, Logan, Frederick Douglass, Old John Brown, armed and known to be dangerous. Reward, dead or alive. Oh. God, gazing, Ezekiel, tell me, do you see Mele Jehovah coming to deliver me. Come, ride my train. Mean, mean, mean to be free. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. There is another tribute to Harriet Tubman. That, of course, was Runagate by Robert Hayden, an African-American poet whom unfortunately you don't find often enough in the literature books about very fine writers. And now the next poem will be by a woman, a white woman, an American woman, Susan Griffin. I like to think of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, who carried a revolver, who had a scar on her head from a rock thrown by a slave master because she talked back, and who had a ransom on her head of thousands of dollars and was never caught, who had no use for the law when the law was wrong. I like to think of her. I like to think of her, especially when I think of the problem of feeding children. Now, the legal answer to the problem of feeding children is 10 free lunches every month, being equal in the child's real life to eating lunch every other day. Monday, but not Tuesday. I like to think of the president eating lunch Monday, but not Tuesday. And when I think of the president and the law and the problem of feeding children, I like to think of Harriet Tubman and her revolver. And when I think of the president and other men, men who make the law, who revere the law, who hide behind and feed themselves at the expense of starving children because of the law, men who sit in panel offices and think about vacations and tell the women whose care it is to feed children, oh, not to be hysterical. Not to be hysterical. As in the word hysterikos, the Greek for womb suffering. Not to suffer in their wombs. Not to bother the men, because the men want to think of other things. Well, I want them to think of Harriet Tubman. And I want them to remember she was beat by a white man, and she lived in swamps, wore the clothes of a man, and led hundreds of fugitives from slavery to freedom, and was never caught. I want them to think about Harriet Tubman. I want them to feel fear, as I have felt suffering in the womb. And I want them to know there is always a time to make right what is wrong, and that time is beginning.